our closing keynote is somebody who I'm sure needs very little introduction. He's been working on .NET and related technologies basically since it was invented. I've been following Scott online since, I don't know, since he started blogging, like back before he worked at Microsoft. And he's one of the people who was instrumental in getting .NET open sourced. You know, you want to talk about big changes. You said to somebody 20, 25 years ago, yeah, one day Microsoft is going to have an open source development platform that runs on Linux. They would have laughed you out of the room. And there were a small number of people who were like, no, we actually think that's a good idea. We want to make that happen. And our next speaker is one of those people. Please welcome, joining us live via the miracle of subatlantic, transatlantic submarine cables, Scott Hanselman.
Hello, how are you, everyone? This is pretty crazy. What a beautiful stage. This is just absolutely lovely. So I'm seeing myself on stage for the first time, and I'm actually going to look here and see. I'm going to point this way, which is the wrong direction for me. So just with also the miracle of technology, I'm going to flip myself so I can go like this because my screen is right there. So I don't have any slides because we like to build stuff here at Build Stuff. I'm going to do everything without slides. We're going to be doing all of this entirely on my screen here. So let's go ahead and do a couple of quick tests to see how it looks. Hey friends, how are we doing? I can't see a lot of you because it's dark, but I can see that we have a beautiful screen and you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to do my best to zoom in and make sure that all of our friends everywhere can see exactly what we're doing. Thank you so much, Naringa and Dylan, for the introduction. And I'm going to do my very best to edutain you. We're going to educate and possibly entertain. So we're going to do some edutainment. Now I am on my Windows machine here. I'm on a Windows 11 machine, and I'm running, I think, Windows 11 Pro, but everything that I'm going to show you can work on Windows 11 Home as well. And that's going to become interesting and important in a little bit. But what we're going to talk about is the command line. We're going to talk about Linux, and we're talking about Windows. We'll talk about development on both of them. And if we have time, we'll do a little bit of cool stuff with containers as well. Now, one of the things that might be interesting, I think Dylan knows this about me, you see my desktop here and you see how clean and fresh that is. Well, that's actually a lie. I've turned off show desktop icons because I wanted you to think that I was organized. But in fact, I have a huge mess of stuff on my desktop, including a bunch of GIFs. But we're not going to talk about those things. So we're just going to go ahead and pretend that none of that stuff exists. And we'll go like that because it's more professional. It looks more keynote-y if we do that. All right. And also, I want to make sure I get some appreciation for the matching LEDs. A lot of work goes into making all of this stuff look like I'm actually there. I wanted it to look like I was actually backstage. So big ups to the crowd who put together this wonderful room here. All right. So I'm sitting here in Windows Terminal. I'm in Windows Terminal, and you'll see in the corner I've got it saying Windows DOS, and I put DOS there in parentheses, and I said, I did it actually with the Comic Sans. This is Comic Sans, and that's not meant to disrespect DOS, but it does point out that this is not really DOS. This is not the DOS that we think about when we think about DOS. But the command line in Windows has historically sucked, and that's a mean thing to say in a keynote. But it's fair to say that historically, from like Windows 95 and on, the command line in Windows has been subpar. It's been not awesome, and we can actually see that on Windows 11. I'm going to go into the terminal here, into the settings, and I can set what the default terminal application is. And right now you can see it says Windows Terminal. I'm going to actually bring this menu down, and I'm going to show you something that a lot of people don't really know about. It's the Windows Console host. And this brings up a lot of very interesting and confusing technical questions, but I think that they're really fun to discuss because we can't talk about Linux without talking about the terminal, and we can't talk about the terminal unless we understand what's going on there. So the command line in Windows is subpar. What do I mean by that? Well, let's switch back to the old command line. I'm going to close Windows Terminal. I'm going to go to the Start menu, and I'm just going to type Command Prompt, and we'll click on Command Prompt. And what's going to pop up is this kind of sad box. And notice that the fonts are very small. I'll zoom in a little bit, but you all remember this. Even though I'm in dark mode, you'll notice that when I click on it, I get this very old looking menu, which is interesting. And when we click on that very old looking menu and I hit Properties, we get this even older looking dialog box. And if you've used Windows for any amount of time, you'll recognize this box. This is a box that never changes. In fact, the last time I think I remember this box changing was when TrueType fonts were invented. We were all very excited about this. This allowed us to actually have nice fonts and not raster fonts. I think there were some pretty goofy looking fonts in here for a while. And this was the terminal that people would look at, and this was the one that we had. It wasn't the terminal that we deserved, but it was the one that we were given. And when I say that it's subpar, what do I mean? Well, one of the first problems with the Windows terminal, not the Windows terminal rather, but the original console rather, was if I do something like dir/s, now be aware that we're on Zoom here, so there's going to be a short delay on the screen sharing. And I start outputting text. On my side, it's going a little bit faster, but you can see that there's a ton of text coming out. One of the funny things about the console on the original Windows was that it actually gets faster if you show less. And people who have done compiling on Windows for a very long period of time know this silly trick, that if you make your console as small as possible, then it has to do less work and it will go faster. That's an interesting architectural little funny thing. Why is that? Well, that brings up the difference between a console and a terminal and a shell and a prompt. And those words matter. Now, we use those words interchangeably. And, words of all languages can be confusing, but when we use English primarily to do our technical work, we interchange these words. We've got shell, we've got prompt, we've got console, we've got terminal. They all mean different things, but people interchange them, they use them. They go, hey, that's a great shell. I like your prompt. Wow, what terminal is that? What do we really mean? Now, if you're on a Mac or you're on Linux, you'll probably get bash for your shell. You probably have the default prompt, or if you're on a newer Mac, you'll get ZSH, and then you'll use, Xterm, you'll use iTerm2, or you'll just use what's called terminal app. But for the most part, you start up your Mac and you get ZSH plus the default terminal. And you think to yourself, cool, it's Linux-y. It's not Linux, it's Linux-y. But it works. It looks like it should, and people see a prompt that looks like this, and you find yourself here at a flashing $sign prompt. But on Windows, we have this strange black box that looks a lot like DOS, and it drops you at a prompt that looks like this, that does not have a $sign, doesn't run Linux commands, and there's no tabs. There's no fun colors, there's no customization, there's just this terminal that does things kind of slowly. So people often find themselves looking for a different console. Well, what is the difference? The shell does your interpretation, it's your interpreter, it's the thing that decides your commands. The prompt is going to be whatever gets put out as the prompt to the user. It might be a $sign, it might be a PS for PowerShell, it might be C:\/ for DOS. The terminal is the application itself. So then what's the console? Well, that's where things get really interesting. And we have to ask ourselves then, what is the difference between a console and a terminal? And I actually went many years ago and I wrote a blog post about this, about the difference between a console, a shell, a terminal. And I titled that blog, What's the Difference? And it brings up that word terminal. A terminal is typically at the terminating or the terminal end of a communication. So we would have these typewriters that were at the end, and I would type and it would go across the wire to the other side and they would see it, or they would type, or the computer would talk to me, and that information would come out on this cool typewriter looking thing. And I think this stuff is really fascinating because from a history perspective, there's a lot of cool things going on. In fact, this here has a manual line feed. And I think that's just so cool because there's a lot of new early in career people that don't even know things like carriage return and line feed. So they'll be using Git in 2022 and someone will say, oh, my carriage returns and my line feeds got confused. And I was talking to an early in career person in my team and they were like, carriage return, what's a carriage and where is it returning to? And then why is it feeding lines? So then we got to get a typewriter. So what I did is I ran to my counter, I ran to my shelf over here, and I got to grab my, I've just showed everyone I have no shoes on. That's very unprofessional for a professional keynote, so my apologies. So then I ran and I got my Lego typewriter, and then we had a whole history lesson about the carriage at the top of the typewriter, so that when you're doing your thing on the Lego typewriter, the carriage is returning and the paper is getting fed one line at a time. So it was really cool that even though we haven't seen a typewriter in a long time, carriage returns and line feeds are command codes that are encoded into our DNA to control those things, and they still matter today. Now we get into some interesting situations because a carriage return and a line feed here is specific to Windows. You can see Notepad there says Windows. This text file is a carriage return and a line feed, but we'll see in a little bit when we start running Linux that Linux doesn't care about carriage returns. It only cares about line feeds. And a lot of people don't realize that historically Mac didn't care about line feeds and only cared about carriage returns. Why? Because they just got to be different. All right, so the console host is the thing that is going to communicate between the shell and the terminal. So when we type something and I hit enter, the command interpreter is going to listen to that. And if I go and run, for example, PowerShell, we'll bring that over here. We have a different black box here. But if I hit properties, I've got that same properties dialog. So that's really interesting. That means that the command prompt and the PowerShell, see how the even command prompt, which is actually a command shell, uses the word wrong, both have the same host. What is the host responsibility? Well, its responsibility is to paint this. That black square, somebody has to paint that. And what we can do is we can open up a process explorer, which is the sysinternal's task manager, and we can look at Process Explorer. And I'm just going to scroll around and look at all these crazy processes. And let's see if we can find the one that started PowerShell. So we've got command prompt. Scroll, scroll, scroll. There's a con host. Where are we looking? I see a bunch of them. Let's try sorting. We'll sort by alphabetical order, and then we'll switch back. Okay, here we go. So there's a bunch of these. And then we'll put it back to this way. You see con host appear multiple times. Console host, console host, console host. There's the one that we actually care about right there. Let's zoom way in. Whee! Look at that. There's the Windows command line. C Windows System32 command.exe. So that's cool. There's the interpreter there. There's the actual command processor, but conhost.exe is really doing the work. Now, if we go and run PowerShell, here's PowerShell. Look at that. There's DOS, there's PowerShell, and darn that conhost has popped up twice. So this box is being drawn by that console host. So if we return over to the Windows terminal now, oops, terminal, we'll bring that up, and we're going to switch our terminal to the new modern Windows terminal, and we're going to hit save. What Windows is going to do is when it says default terminal application, it's going to be a new con host. We're going to take over the console host and we're going to put someone else in charge of doing the painting, which means that I can now come out to my run dialog and I'll say command or PowerShell or whatever, and a different box will start up. We're going to take over and a different box will pop up. So boom, now I typed command.exe and Windows Terminal popped up. This is now the default terminal experience as of today in Windows 11. If you don't see this, if you're running Windows 10, you can go into the Windows Store and you can go and search for terminal. And you'll see the Windows terminal, and then you will also see the Windows terminal preview. So it's up to you. You can pick the one that makes you happy. But you have this by default. And when you have set your console host as being the default, you'll see in the start menu, command prompt and terminal. But because we've taken over that console host, in fact, we're going to have that command prompt happen by terminal. So why did I spend 15 minutes talking about the terminal? Because it's going to make your Linux experience on Windows just that much more lovely. Because I can pull this menu down here, I've got tabs, and we see PowerShell, the original classic Windows PowerShell, the command prompt, and then look at this. What is going on here? We've got Debian, we've got Kali Linux, we've got Ubuntu. I can actually go and look at that. Let's zoom in really, really close on our friend here. Look at that. We've got our little tux. We've got our little Linux man, little Linux penguin sitting there, indicating that we have a bunch of different subsystems here. These are complete instances of Linux. These are different choices. This is a lot more than you get on a Mac, and I think it's really overwhelming because for the average developer, you're just going to open command or you're going to open PowerShell. But when you start getting into more advanced things, you're going to want choice. And what we have here is a huge amount of choice. It's also worth pointing out that we have the developer command prompt for Visual Studio right here, which means that when other custom shells get brought in, Terminal is going to recognize them and identify them. And if I don't like those, I can put in my own. So I can go here to settings and I can change profiles and put in whatever I want. Now, why is that interesting? Because look at Git Bash. Git Bash is a third-party thing. It was installed with Git, and it is going to show me Cygwin. So here, I'm in a very Linuxy environment. This is actually a Windows app. It's the user mode tools for GNU compiled to run on Windows. And this allows me to do things like run ls and run grep and sed and awk and do kinds of Linuxy things. But you'll notice when I say pwd, print working directory, we're on the C drive. This is installed with Git to make people feel comfortable, which I think is important. And from there, I can go and run Git and Git version and Git status. But it's not Linux. It's just, as we saw before when we talked about Mac, it's Linux-y. It's Linuxy enough, right? It's a GNU bash shell for Windows. But what I want to do is I want to run the Windows subsystem for Linux. Now, if you have already been using this, you're probably enjoying it, and hopefully I'll show you some things that you haven't seen before. But when I type in WSL, I get a WSL.exe, which will give me a bunch of different choices. I'm actually going to go back here and I'm going to say WSL-list-v, and that's going to list out all of the Linuxes that I have on my machine right now. You can see that Ubuntu is marked with a star, and we can see something called Podman. We also see Docker Desktop, but our main Linuxi are here. Oracle Linux, Ubuntu. I've got both 2004, 1804, and then 2204 is also in the store, which is crazy. Think about this. I liked what Dylan said, that if you told people 20 years ago that we would have like .NET completely open source and running on Linux, people would laugh you out of the room. I think that if they told you you could go into the Microsoft Store and type Linux, and then it would actually pop up this little guy and give you a 4.5, almost 5-star application that you could click on and install Linux. That'd be pretty cool, and they'd laugh you out of the room. Now, this one here says preview. It's not preview. This is the preview version, just like we saw before with terminal. There's the terminal, and then there's the terminal preview. So you can decide if you want to be stable or if you want to live dangerously. Same thing applies with the Windows subsystem for Linux. You already have this on your machine. Comes with Windows. It's shipped with Windows for a long time. But if you want, you can go and get the preview. That will install over the top, and you'll have some new features, which is cool. Now, if you don't have this on your machine, you want to make sure you have Windows Terminal, that you understand the difference, and that you're aware of this menu right here. All right. And you're going to type WSL-install. And WSL-install will set up everything that is needed for you to have this Windows subsystem for Linux on your machine. Now, I'm not going to use DOS anymore because I like PowerShell. And I've got my PowerShell logo down here in the corner, so I can tell the difference. Windows Terminal, in fact, lets me do this if I want. I'm going to hold down the Alt button with my left thumb, and I'm going to say Command Prompt. I'm going to say Ubuntu, and I'm going to say Git Bash. So now I've got Git Bash, PowerShell, Command Prompt, and Ubuntu on my system here in 4 individual panes. And if I want to hit Alt-Enter, I can go full screen, and you'll notice at the bottom there, my taskbar coming and going. So I can be in a nice, clean, full screen terminal environment if I want to. And I've gone and I've remapped the commands, remapped the hotkeys inside of the Windows terminal because I want it to behave like a browser. So when I hit Control-T, it opens a new terminal. And when I hit Control-W, it closes it, just like closing a tab. So I'm going to go click, 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 just Control-W, 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 and get out of each one of those. Now, when I say WSL --list, I can also say --online. And this is a list of valid Linux distributions that I could go and install right now. So if I wanted to, I could go and say WSL --install SLES15. And that is going to go now to the Windows Store, and it's going to download that. Now, when I say Windows Store, in this case, think about it as just a content distribution network. This is not a Windows version of SUSE. This is not a Windows version of Debian. These are the actual distributions. These are just the tar files. The tar files are living in the Windows Store, so we're bringing those down. So here we are. Just while I was talking there, this has just become installed. Installation successful. Let's go ahead and make our username. Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for that gift. Oh, for crying out loud. People are watching. What are you doing? Oh my gosh. What is happening? Hunter 2. Yeah, that's fine, whatever. All right, cool. Now I'm going to close the terminal. I'm going to run it again. And we'll pop that up. And I want to point out, where did it go? There. There's our OpenSUSE. It just appeared now. Okay. So what that means is if I type WSL --list, look at that. Now I've got another Linux. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different Linuxes, and I've got Podman and Docker all at the same time. And you can see that which ones are running and which ones are not. And that gives me a lot of flexibility to go and develop and test my applications, which is super cool. Now, let's open up PowerShell. And then I'm going to open up on the other side Ubuntu in a second. By the way, I just want to point out my prompt is a little bit blinged out. It's pretty cool. I'm using Oh My Posh as my prompt, not my shell, not my console, but my prompt. So this prompt right here is actually showing the version of .NET that I have installed. It's showing my current Git branch, that I have some 6 files that are unknown in my source control. And then that right there with the needle there, that's my blood sugar. So I'm actually a diabetic. I have type 1 diabetes, and I have a IoT system that is sending my blood sugar up into the cloud into a Mongo database. So I have a REST API. I have a REST API for my body. Because don't we all? I mean, really all of us, I think, have some kind of REST API. But you can see that that's my blood sugar. And that's really important to me, because the 2 things that are most important in life is my current Git branch and my blood sugar. So I like to have that there. Unrelated to Linux, but still pretty cool. All right, now let's go and open up Ubuntu. I can open it up in another tab like this, or I could go split screen. If I went split screen, I would hold down Alt with my thumb. I'm going to click and I'm going to say Ubuntu. And then now I've got PowerShell on the one side and I've got Ubuntu on the other. Now, again, I have the same prompt, but it still is really Ubuntu. Now, I want to point out that on the Windows side, I'm going to be in C:/GitHub Hanselman, which is my website. Oops. We'll go into a directory and you can see my files. And then over here, I want to point out, I'm going to go into that similar Hanselman folder, but not the same folder. And I'm going to do ls, or maybe ll, and look at pwd. I am not on C:/GitHub Hanselman. I'm on home Scott. I'm on a different file system. On Windows, when you run Linux in this way, you have your own Linux file system. And you can prove that, in fact, you can prove that by running df. So I'm going to run df, and I'm going to look at the file system. And we can see the file system available to us and what's mounted and what's not. And I want to note these mount points here. We've got mount C, mount D. That's my Windows file system. So this is another world. This is a tiny, what's called a utility virtual machine. It's a little tiny virtual machine that is spinning up here, but it's not in that major Hyper-V kind of a way. Hyper-V virtual machines, it's like, here's a giant virtual hard drive. We're going to spin up a square, and then you're going to have your computer, and you're going to have a square, and that's another computer, a virtual computer, and it gets, how much deeper can you run a VM within a VM? This is not meant to be like that. You'll notice that I've been running around inside of Windows, opening Linuxes, and I'm not slowing down. I'm not waiting for anything. And that's really significant. We want these Linuxes to start and then stop to reclaim memory appropriately. Even though I've been running around and doing all of that work, you can see here, this virtual machine manager is only right now at 2 gigs, and it'll just go up and down depending on what I'm doing, even though I'm running a ton of these different things. Additionally, it is real Linux. If I run htop, you can see all 24 of my processors here. This is about a 5 or 6 year old machine. It's not like the greatest machine, but it does okay. If we go over here to the CPU, you can see it's got, it's an i9, 10th gen i9. I think they're on generation 13 now. And within the htop, you see all of the things that I have available. So I have effectively unlimited resources here. Now, if we go back over here, we've got Windows on the left and we've got Ubuntu on the right. It's important that I stay on my own file system for performance reasons. If I were in Linux to go over to Mount C, and then I'm going to go down into user, oops, did I go into Mount C? And then what is it? Is it documents and settings? I think it's users, Scott, OneDrive. And now I'm into the beast at this point, right? Like we're lost. OneDrive, desktop. There we go. At this point here, we are talking from Linux to Windows over a mount point, and I'm going to pay the price. It's not going to be super fast, and that makes sense. So I do my development work in Linux on that file system. So you'll notice here that my prompt is telling me to bring down some changes. So I'm going to say git pull, and I'm bringing down the latest changes to my website right here, and you can see those fast forwarded. That is really important to note, that the way to collaborate in this case between Windows and Linux, if I wanted to run it in both places, is to just use the different file systems and use Git to do that work. But when I say .NET build, I'm running .NET. It is real .NET, but it's .NET on Linux. And I can in fact say which .NET, and you'll notice that it's not C program files.net, it's user bin.net. Well, if I go over here, over to PowerShell, and I'm in Windows again, and I say where.net, that is in fact programfiles.net, .net.exe. Okay, can be a little bit confusing, but it's confusing in an awesome way. Now, remember when I said that virtual machines are just boxes, they're just these boxes inside of boxes. That's not very integrated with Windows. I want this to be truly integrated. So we saw that I can go to the C drive, but what other kind of crazy stuff could I do? If I've got some code here, I could certainly type vim and look at program.cs, and here's my code in vim. And of course, nobody knows how to exit vim. So at this point, I just need to reboot the entire computer or shut the terminal down. But what I can do is, what if I could run Notepad? That would be stupid. Well, I can't, because Notepad's not a Linux thing, right? But I could run notepad.exe, which is a Windows thing. And because we're on Windows and we're running Linux under Windows, WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, could say, I don't know what that is, command not found, and just throw it up higher and say, it's above me now. Maybe someone else knows what that is. And I could say notepad.exe. And I've just run a Windows app like that from Linux. And then we come down here and we note Notepad knows about Linux file endings now, which is crazy. Again, to Dylan's point, if you opened up a Notepad and opened up a text file 20 years ago in Windows, you'd be pretty surprised about that and notice that that was supporting Linux file endings. So we're still on the Linux file system. What if I said explorer.exe instead of Notepad? That would be a thing. Let's try explorer.exe and let's pass in dot for the current folder. Popped up over on another monitor. Explorer.exe just ran. And look, WSL, Ubuntu, and now I'm looking at my file system. So we have a bridge in multiple directions here. And that's super powerful. I can say from Linux, talk to Windows over that mount point, or in this case, from Windows, talk to Linux using this, what's called a Plan 9 server. So you'll notice here inside of Windows Explorer, all my Linuxes appear as network shares, but they're local network shares. So I can do all of this on an airplane. They're not real network shares. And then the real brainwave is Linux, and our little Tux friend appears in Explorer right now. So Linux is a first-class citizen sitting here alongside my PC, my hard drive, and my network. So there's my work, my PC, my network, and then I've got Linux right there. From here, I could go into Ubuntu, into Home and Scott, and I could edit those files. I could edit my profile. So I can use Linux in my way. It is truly integrated into Windows, which is really, really cool. But from a development perspective, if I can type Notepad and I can type Explorer, then what if I could type code and hit code dot? Now I've just launched into Visual Studio Code, but in the corner here, it says WSL Ubuntu. So I've connected remotely to myself locally, because what's happened is Visual Studio Code has split in half. The client part of Visual Studio Code is here. That is, in fact, the Windows version of Visual Studio Code. But if we go back over here and we just do an htop, we can actually see VS Code server. VS Code server running inside of Linux. That's weird. Let's go here into the extensions and let's make a note that we have 34 extensions locally, but 2 of them are exclusive inside of WSL. So the C# extension and then the one for views, for Vue.js is plugged in there. That means that when I go and search for some extension, if I wanted to install, for example, Python, do I want to install it in Ubuntu or do I want to install it in Windows or not? So you can see for a moment, I could install things locally or I can install things inside of Ubuntu. That's really, really powerful. And then you'll note also that down here, I've got a terminal inside of Visual Studio Code. And that terminal in this case is letting me talk to Linux, but I can decide what I want to do and I can totally control the shells and the things. And if you're a Linux person, you can do tmux, you can do screen. It all works exactly as you would expect. Even more, Visual Studio Senior, the Visual Studio full version, also allows you to do things in WSL. We'll install things like .NET, and I can do interactive debugging as well, which is super powerful. The last thing I want to show you, because I realize that I'm standing between you and a party, or you and dinner, or you and beer, and you're standing between me and breakfast, is I can go to the Start menu, I can go to All Apps, and then I'll go down here to Ubuntu, and I will point out that I've got apps in my Windows Start menu with little Linux dudes on them. So let's go back down there. Doot, 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 boop, boop. And I've got GNU image manipulation program, which I'm going to bring over from another monitor. Whoop, look at that. So here is a Linux application on Windows. It ran instantly. Didn't have to install X Windows, didn't have to configure anything. This is WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux, G, for graphical applications. So if there's an app that you can't get on Windows, like Giggle is a really good Git management system that I can run that does not have a Windows version. I can go in there and I can hit Ubuntu. I could go, wow, I got GVim, I got Giggle. I could go then and pin that to the Start menu. I can even run Linux Firefox or whatever. I've got this Cura 3D printer here. These are Linux apps that are integrated in. I can pin them to my Start menu, put them on my taskbar, play games, do whatever. And you see that they actually look and behave like Linux apps because in fact they are. You can see here as I move between the app, the cursor goes between big cursor, big mouse gang, and small. So there's a lot of really, really cool stuff happening in this space right now. I didn't get a chance to talk too much about Docker, but I do want to point out before I leave that I can run both Docker, or in this case, I'm running Podman. Podman is an alternative to Docker. You have choice. And recently, yesterday, with .NET 7, we just announced that you can build containers directly from .NET without Docker or Podman installed. So even if you don't use any of these tools, you can still go and build containers and push them to a container registry. And in this case here, with Podman on my Windows machine, I can go and do things like Podman images and see the images that I've got for my podcast. And you can see just a couple of days ago, I built my podcasting application, tagged it, and it's running in Podman, which in fact uses WSL underneath, because that Podman machine is a Windows Subsystem for Linux instance, as is the Docker one. All right, that is all demos, 45 minutes tight, remotely from Portland. That was pretty cool. I can't hear you or see you because it's dark, but that's all I've got. And I hope that you have a lovely show as Dylan and our friends come back on stage. And hopefully that didn't suck because I was super
fantastic
nervous.
stuff. Thank you, Scott.
Can't see you.
Enjoy breakfast,
Thank you,
my friend.
I thought that went okay.
And folks, that's a wrap from us here at Build Stuff 2022. I think there is a plan to take some photographs with all of the speakers and the crew. So if you are speakers or crew, Please make your way to the front. We're going to get the photographers in to do that. And if you're not, thank you everyone for coming. It's been fantastic spending these last couple of days with all of you. I hope you all had a great time. I hope to see probably some of you in the bar this evening, and I hope to see all of you back here next year. Folks, that was Built Stuff 2022. Take it easy. Safe travels. See you next time.